Good morning. It is Friday, March the 19th, and this is The Drill. Thank you. And I'm Ron, your host and the only true conservative in the United States today. And welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers. And we go to the daily declaration for spiritual warfare. You will command mountains to be removed. If you have faith in my power at work in your life, you will be able to command any mountain that rises up against me or my power in you to fall into the sea. Stand firm in your faith, for many will say in their hearts that they want to ascend to heaven. They will try to establish their throne above the tops of the clouds so that they may be like the Most High. But with my power at work in you, you will bring them down to the depths of the pit. In the last days, the mountains of my holy temple will be established as chief among the mountains. It will be raised above the hills, and all nations will stream to it. Many peoples will come and say, "Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord. He will teach us his ways so that we may walk in his path." Prayer declaration. I speak to every mountain in my life and command it to be removed and cast into the sea. I speak to every financial mountain to be removed from my life in Jesus' name. Let every evil mountain hear the voice of the Lord and be removed. Let the mountains tremble at the presence of God. Lord, you are against every destroying mountain. Make waste the evil mountains in my life, O Lord. Amen. So today, I'm going to be... I have something a little bit new. I'm going to be reading from a book about the Uyghurs, the foreword to a particular book, and then I'm going to read it'll be commandment number 8 from the 10 Commandments of progressive Christianity and more when I come back. Thank you. And let me see here. This and this. I'm reading a book about the Uyghurs. It's not the whole book. It's the foreword to a particular book about the Uyghurs. And I'm doing so because it seems to be the subject du jour. I was listening to Hugh Hewitt, and he had some guests on. They were talking about the Uyghurs, and they kept using the word genocide. Kept throwing that one around very breezily. And the problem with that is that it should be very alarming to everybody in this country, because when you're talking about genocide, that's fighting words, one of the fighting words. You start accusing other countries of committing genocide, you have to do something about that. You can't just say, well, you're committing genocide, so there, and walk away. You have to start amassing troops, and you have to start making preparations for invasion so that you can stop that genocide if you want to proclaim yourself to be any type of a moral authority in the world. So they're doing that, and I wanted to get, and the funny part about this is that they're using sources that yesterday they said had no integrity and no credibility. They're using news sources, the New York Times, the LA Times. They're using whatever information is leaked out from a closed society. The Chinese communist government is not an open society news-wise and information-wise. So you're going to have to get your information from whatever is able to leak out and then filtered through the Associated Press, United Press International, Reuters, New York Times, etc. And all of those sources have been declared to have no integrity, no credibility. They've been described and denounced roundly by conservatives or so-called conservatives as being nothing more than mouthpieces for the DNC. So I figured maybe I can try and get some information from a source other than so-called news sources. So the foreword is written by a guy named Ben Emerson QC. I think that probably means he's British. Former UN Special Rapporteur on Counterterrorism and former judge of the United Nations International Criminal Tribunals for Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia. Over the past 2 years, the international community has become increasingly aware of the relentless persecution of the Uyghurs in East Turkestan, also known as the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, by the authoritarian Chinese Communist Party. This ancient community has become stigmatized as enemies of the monolithic Chinese state that occupies its homeland. They have been subjected to collective punishment in the form of mass incarceration in concentration camps aimed at their so-called re-education. Between 1 million and 3 million Uyghurs have disappeared into this dystopian prison estate. The Chinese government claims these institutions are voluntary re-education camps designed to eradicate extremism among the Muslim population of East Turkestan. The reality is that they are part of a much wider strategy aimed at eliminating the separate ethno-cultural identity of the Uyghurs and effectively wiping them off the map as a separate ethnic group. In my role as United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Counterterrorism, I spent 6 years examining the various means used by different states to prevent the spread of violent extremism and to counter the appeal of extremist narratives. I examined various programs from Europe to the Middle East, from Sweden to Saudi Arabia. None of them have involved a wholesale attack on an entire community or the mass incarceration of entirely innocent people solely on the basis of their ethnicity or religion. What is happening in Xinjiang province is not, in any sense, a legitimate counterterrorism strategy. On the contrary, collective punishment of this kind is, in itself, a fundamental human rights violation on a mass scale. Strategies that inflict deep psychological wounds on an entire community never succeed. They are invariably counterproductive and nurse the very grievances that cause people to turn to extreme ideologies. The Chinese Communist Party is using counterterrorism as a fig leaf for cultural genocide. Inside the camps, the regime is regulated by directives that are designed to break the will of those who have been imprisoned. That is the first step in classic program of brainwashing. The individual's autonomy is completely eliminated. Every tiny aspect of their daily lives, from where they sit to where they can speak, is controlled with vicious attention to detail. Any deviation is met with severe forms of punishment. Prisoners are forbidden from using their own language, from practicing their religion, or manifesting their cultural identity in any way. They are held incommunicado, cut off from the outside world, and are only eligible for release after incarceration for months or years. In order to have any chance of being considered for release, they must prove that they have been absorbed or have absorbed the official Han Chinese orthodoxy and have abandoned their independent identity altogether. The camps are only part of the state apparatus that has been mobilized against the Uyghurs. There have been widespread and credible reports of torture, disappearances, forced sterilization, and organ harvesting. Traditional Uyghur burial sites and other sites of cultural heritage have been bulldozed and are being built upon as this book goes to press. These are the hallmarks of cultural genocide, a policy that aims at the destruction of the separate identity of a distinct ethnic, cultural, or religious group. China has, so far, eluded effective international action against it. That is because it is not party to any of the international human rights treaties that would enable other states to enforce the basic rules of human rights and humanitarian law. But there is no doubt whatsoever that the actions of the Chinese authorities amount to crimes against humanity. They constitute a widespread and systemic attack on the civilian population, and they may be pointers towards the commission of the crime of genocide. It is vital for the international community to take urgent action. A group of mainly Western states has recently condemned the persecution of the Uyghurs at the UN level. The U.S. Secretary of State has also taken up the issue on a bilateral level, and efforts are afoot to impose sanctions on Chinese officials through so-called Magnitsky legislation in the U.S. Other countries with Magnitsky legislation, including the U.K., need to follow suit urgently. Sean Roberts' account of China's war on the Uyghurs provides a vital resource for those wishing to understand the background to this human rights atrocity. It traces the history of Uyghur nationalism and objectively examines the evidence exposing the myths perpetrated by the Chinese Communist Party to justify this atrocity in the making. This book should act as a wake-up call for policymakers worldwide. Armed with the piercing and detailed analysis of the recent past in East Turkestan and the graphic accounts of the present, no one has any further excuse for failing to grasp the full reality of the human tragedy that is taking place. Roberts demystifies the background, debunks the false excuses of the Chinese state, and presents the reality of the persecution unfolding before our eyes. None of us can afford to look away. And that was the foreword to this book on about the Uyghurs and China's, the war. It's what the book's called, The War on the Uyghurs. Now, one of the things, the key word here is genocide. What I heard from Hugh Hewitt was he's throwing around the word genocide as though people are actually being slaughtered. When I hear the word genocide, first thing I think of is the Jews in World War II. And they were being gassed and then cremated, and that was genocide. They were gassed, sometimes they were shot and left in mass graves. Genocide, there's no doubt about that. And so we have that description being used on Hugh Hewitt's show, and yet when we read this book, what they're talking about is not genocide at all, but what is a metaphor, cultural genocide. And that is, metaphors are key in our communications these days. But in this particular case, we have to be very careful in throwing around genocide as a metaphor. Genocide, again, is a fighting word. It's a war word. If a country is actually committing genocide against a part of its population, then the rest of the world should be getting mobilized for war, mobilizing to invade this particular country and put a stop to this genocide. That's the only thing you can do. To do anything else is just mental masturbation. We're going to, isolate them trade-wise. We're going to do... No. Genocide requires immediate military action. So, again, is that what we're looking forward to here? Is that what's being promoted? Is that what we have in the offing here? Or do we have leaders, so-called leaders in Washington, D.C., that are planning to conduct some kind of raids or let's say Saddam Hussein-style invasions of China in an effort to rescue the Uyghurs? Because, again, if you're going to be throwing around the word genocide, there is no other way to stop it. There is nothing else to do except go to war. And I really don't see anybody in Washington, D.C. or anywhere else preparing for war or even wanting to prepare for war. So there's a big gap between what it is that they say is happening and their words and their actions. Let's put it that way. A huge gap between their words and their actions. So when I come back, I'm going to be reading the 8th commandment of the 10 commandments of progressive Christianity. Thank you. And let's see here. We got this discombobulated. Where are we at here? Oh, here we go. And so we have the 8th commandment of the 10 commandments of progressive Christianity. And that is, peacemaking is more important than power. And all of these things that I'm reading out of this book are applicable to secular issues. This is the way that the left thinks, period. It's not just in relation to Christianity, but the way they think about the world at large. It's their worldview. So, for those frustrated with the institutional religion, it can be seen as though the church leaders are chiefly concerned with having and maintaining their own power. Indeed, it might even seem like churches attract power-hungry people, eager to lord it over others. The eighth commandment of progressive Christianity is designed to push back against this problem. Peacemaking is more important than power. We can begin by acknowledging that much in this eighth commandment is right. God does not call church leaders to heavy-handed self-preservation, but to humble, sacrificial service. As Peter charges elders, quote, shepherd the flock of God, not domineering over those in your charge, but being examples to the flock, unquote. 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 2 through 3. Gully makes his case by providing several examples of bad church leadership. Pastors/elders hungry for control and willing to step on and over others to get it. I'm sure most Christians could tell similar stories from their own experience. However, as in prior chapters, Gully sometimes has the right diagnosis, but the wrong or woefully incomplete cure. As we shall see below, in order to rid the church of bad authority, Gully offers an overly egalitarian approach to leadership that may end up stripping the church of the authority it really does need. Gully makes the proper distinction between authority and authoritarianism. While the former is legitimate, the latter is destructive. Authoritarianism is a heavy-handed, top-down, near-abusive form of leadership that can harm individuals and the church as a whole. Jesus himself recognized the dangers of authoritarian leadership. Quote, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. It shall not be so among you, but whoever would be great among you must be your servant, unquote. Matthew chapter 20, verses 25 to 26. Gully is also right to suggest that authoritarian leadership should be dealt with sooner rather than later. Quote, the sooner authoritarianism is challenged, the healthier the church will be, unquote. But the question immediately arises, how does one know if leadership is authoritarian? Gully offers a helpful consideration. Quote, does it build others up or does it put them down, unquote. This echoes the words of Paul. Quote, for even if I boast a little too much of our authority, which the Lord gave for building you up and not for destroying you, unquote. 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 8. As we shall see, however, much depends on how one understands the difference between building up and putting down. While Gully is to be commended for calling out authoritarian leadership, some questions remain about what the exercise of good authority looks like. What is the extent of the church's legitimate authority? This is where things become a little fuzzy. For example, we might wonder whether the church or its leaders have the authority to condemn false doctrine. Can church leaders use their authority to uphold truth and reject error? Apparently, Gully doesn't think so. He tells the story of a female pastor who was examined by a committee over concerns regarding her progressive theology. But in Gully's mind, the questioning was itself an abuse of power. Quote, the committee had moved from having the genuine authority to wielding authoritarian authority, from building others up to tearing others down, unquote. The committee, says Gully, was just about, quote, command and control, unquote. How is upholding sound doctrine an abuse of authority? Does the church have no control over what is taught? Doesn't Paul tell Titus that it is an elder's job to, quote, to give instruction in sound doctrine and also to rebuke those who contradict it, unquote? Titus chapter 1, verse 9. And don't all authorities, even legitimate godly ones, still need some level of, quote, command and control, unquote? If they don't, are they really authorities? Such confusion and inconsistency raises questions about Gully's view of the church authority. It almost seems like any exercise of authority is viewed as inappropriate, tyrannical, or somewhere in between. And such sentiments are not unusual within progressive Christianity. As we've seen in earlier chapters, the progressive package at its core has a distinct anti-authority vibe. No one can tell us what to do or what to believe, although, ironically, Gully's entire book is about what to do and what to believe. If people in the church should pursue peace instead of power, as Gully suggests, then what exactly does that mean? Incredibly, he takes the opportunity to make his case for pacifism and to chide the American church for supporting the military. So, quote, peace, unquote, according to Gully, is once again viewed in purely horizontal terms. It is peace among nations. It is a lack of military conflict. Leaving the issue of pacifism aside, we can certainly agree that bringing reconciliation to broken human relationships is a fundamental biblical value. As already observed, the Bible speaks of forgiving one another, being reconciled to one another, husbands and wives reconciling, and the removal of hostility between groups. However, missing entirely from Gulley's analysis is any consideration of how this horizontal peace is achieved. Do we simply try harder? Does a church become a miniature version of the UN? Do we protest the various wars and armed conflicts around the world? The Scriptures provide an answer to the questions of how peace is achieved. Quote, "For he, Jesus, himself is our peace, who has made us both one and has broken down in his flesh the dividing wall of hostility." Unquote. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 14. The power to love one another and to keep the bond of peace begins with understanding God's love for us in Christ. The latter is the foundation for the former. Quote, "We love because he first loved us." Unquote. 1 John chapter 4, verse 19. In other words, horizontal peace begins first with recognizing our need for vertical peace, and only Jesus can provide such vertical peace with God. Remarkably, Gulley seems uninterested in how Jesus brings peace. For him, peace is purely a political and social concept. Again, progressive Christianity, with its disinterest in doctrine, and therefore its disinterest in Jesus, is reduced to mere moralism. Gulley is right to point out the problems with the authoritarian church leaders who seek to rule over the flock rather than to gently shepherd it. Such leaders can do serious damage to individual members and to the church as a whole. But while Gulley is correct on the diagnosis, doubts remain about the cure. In an effort to rid the church of authoritarian leaders, as he understands them, he may have to rid the church of authority altogether. Ironically, that makes the church even more vulnerable to abusive individuals and false teachings. Bad leadership is not solved by having no leadership. Instead, bad leadership is to be replaced with godly, gentle, Christ-centered leadership. Moreover, Gulley continues to think only in horizontal terms. Without Jesus and without the good news of the gospel, he never explains how the arduous and near impossible task of peacekeeping is to be achieved. Apparently, local churches should just try harder and do more. That kind of peacekeeping becomes a moralistic yoke around our necks, a plow we must pull in our own strength. We would do better to turn to Jesus, the one who is the great bringer of peace, and he gives it freely. Quote, "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you." Unquote. John chapter 14, verse 27. So that was chapter 8 of the book, The 10 Commandments of Progressive Christianity. And so again, all of this really is, when you look deep enough into these, is what they're doing is they're secularizing the church, secularizing Christianity, trying to take God and Christ out of the picture. Like you said, when you're talking about moralism, you're really talking about socialism, and and that's what they're trying to do: socialize the church and replace one form of authority with another. They're not saying that everybody should do what they want in the church. Gulley is really saying everybody should do what he wants in the church. He wants to be the authority. He thinks he should be the authority. And again, it's just a way of, it's false Christianity. And one of the things that you can do is when you go to church and you're hearing these kinds of messages, you're not in a church. You're in a socialist clubhouse. And it's time to go. Thank you. That brings me to the conclusion of another episode of The Drill. We have covered the Uyghurs and the dangerous idea of just throwing around the word genocide and using genocide as a metaphor. And we've also covered chapter 8, or the 8th commandment of the 10 commandments of progressive, so-called progressive Christianity. Really what it is, the eighth commandment of socialism. So until next time, be honest, be smart, be beautiful. I'm Ron, and that's the drill.